So I want to give you a little bit of an outline on where we're headed today. First, I'm going to give a little bit of background about Xerces, and then talk a little bit about mosquito life history and biology. With pest control in general, a good thing to keep in mind is that you always want to know the biology and the life history of the organism you're working with, because then you can better understand how to break the cycle and manage the pest. We're also going to talk about some concerns with the pesticide-intensive control methods, and then talk about what you can do at home, some common sense, ecologically friendly, and easy management practices that you can employ at home to control mosquitoes. And then we're going to talk a little bit about community level change, about scaling up from your own yard to maybe your block, neighborhood, and broader community. And we'll also share some resources that are available at the Xerces website. And I first want to acknowledge and thank all of these Xerces Society supporters. Without them, we could not do the work we do, and their support is really so important. And on that note, I want to add that we are a donor-supported nonprofit. So if you aren't already a member and you're able, I really encourage you to donate and become a member today. You'll really be joining an extraordinary group of people who have shown themselves to be inquisitive, engaged, and who truly care about protecting invertebrates. So yeah, you can follow the link right there at xerces.org/donate. So if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society before, if this is your first webinar with us, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. And our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. And it lived in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work with programs focusing on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides. We have people working on mussels, and we do a lot of community engagement work in residential communities. So we really work in all sorts of areas. And on this slide, we kind of have some snapshots of what some of those different areas that Xerces works in looks like. But perhaps the most helpful work we do is writing detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. And you can visit our website for free national as well as regional resources on plants, pollinators, and other invertebrates. And this library is really decades of work, and it has fantastic resources. So I really encourage you to all go check it out at xerces.org. There's mosquitoes. There's materials related to mosquito control, what we're talking about today. But also things like, again, habitat creation for pollinators, plant selection, endangered species conservation, pesticide reduction, and much, much more. Okay, so today we're talking about mosquitoes. So I know most of us, or a lot of us, might think of mosquitoes as being, maybe not our favorite insects. They're annoying. Sometimes they bite you and make itchy welts, and they can vector diseases. But there's over 170 species of mosquitoes in the United States and about 3,500 species of mosquitoes worldwide. And mosquitoes are actually flies. They're diptera, so they're related to houseflies and syrphid flies that you might see visiting your flowers. And many of them don't actually bite or feed on humans. But of course, there are a subset of mosquitoes that do bite and will feed on humans, but we're not their primary source of food. Instead, adults drink nectar from flowers for energy, and in the chur stage, the larvae are aquatic, and they actually feed on microorganisms and algae in the water that they're developing in. Of course, human blood is part of the diet, but only for reproductive females. They need to feed on blood, called a blood meal, for extra nutrition and protein to help develop their eggs. And male mosquitoes don't actually bite. I remember once going on, and often they actually emerge before the females and wait to mate. I remember going on a hike once, and it was kind of near a wetland area, and a bunch of mosquitoes rode us up, and I was ready to kind of run away. But then looking closer, they were almost all males, and they weren't bothering us at all. So just kind of an interesting thing there. And many that do bite humans are only nuisances. They can be really aggravating and annoying, but they don't act as vectors for disease. So despite the common misconception that mosquitoes aren't anything but a nuisance, they're just pests, they actually do play ecological roles. So first, they're a food source. So all sorts of other insects will feed on mosquitoes in their larval stage. Dragonflies, damselflies, copepods all will feed on mosquito larvae. And then as adult mosquitoes, other insects will eat them, as well as birds and bats. And for the birds and bats, they might not be a huge portion of their diet, but they do contribute as a food source. Kind of as a part of that being a food source, larval mosquitoes, the immature stage, contribute to nutrient cycling in wetland areas. The larval stage is aquatic, as I mentioned, living in water, and they eat microorganisms, again, like algae and microbes. And some of these are obviously eaten as larvae, but surviving mosquitoes then can fly to land and are either eaten by other predators or will die and decompose. And this contributes to the movement of nutrients from wetlands to kind of more upland areas. And again, mosquitoes are tiny, and this might not seem like a very substantial contribution, but in Alaska, for example, there are an estimated 96 million pounds of mosquitoes each year. So this can be a significant contribution. Mosquitoes are also pollinators. Though they might not pollinate at the level of bees or other types of flies, adult mosquitoes do visit flowers to sip nectar for energy. And unlike bees, they're not actively collecting pollen. This is why bees are such good pollinators. They're actively collecting and moving pollen grains from flower to flower. But mosquitoes do get pollen grains stuck to them and pollinate, sometimes as generalists and other times as specialists. So one study in Europe found that mosquito visitation significantly increased seed set in tansy flowers, which kind of shows that they do more than just steal nectar. They can pollinate. And some flowers have actually evolved to have mosquitoes as a pollinator. The blunt-leafed orchid, for example, is found here where I am in the Pacific Northwest, but also throughout the United States, kind of in the more northern part of the country up into the Northeast. And researchers have found that certain mosquitoes are preferentially attracted to this orchid due to certain chemical compounds in its odor. And orchids that don't have that odor don't attract mosquitoes as pollinators. So mosquitoes aren't just itchy annoyances, they do play ecological roles, which I think is an important thing to consider. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that mosquitoes can be vectors of disease that impact humans and livestock. And the concern is real with a changing climate expanding the range of some mosquito species, along with international travel, potentially spreading new mosquito-borne diseases, creating a growing concern about new diseases establishing in the United States. And of course, existing diseases can be quite worrisome as well. Some you might be familiar with are certain types of encephalitis, West Nile, which arrived in the 1990s and is now found throughout the country. There's the concern over Zika and avian dengue fever. Cases have been found in Texas, Hawaii, Florida, and outlying territories. So we in no way want to minimize the seriousness of these diseases, nor the risk that they can pose to people. But there are many times pesticides are used to treat mosquitoes that is unnecessary. It won't help solve any human health concerns and will negatively impact the broader insect community. So this is why we need to be prepared ahead so that we don't let fear drive decisions. And having a solid mosquito management plan can help reduce the potential of contracting mosquito-borne diseases. So I want to talk a little bit about the mosquito life cycle. As I mentioned earlier, this is important to understand to know how to control a pest. So the adult mosquito, which is what we commonly see flying, here making that kind of mosquito droning noise and biting us, making itchy welts, is only one stage of the mosquito life cycle. So mosquitoes lay their eggs in stagnant water, and they only need a really small amount of water, about the amount in a bottle cap, to reproduce. And females typically lay around 100 eggs at a time, and adult females can lay multiple times throughout their life. And the eggs that mosquitoes lay can actually stick to the edges of a container. And say if the water level drops, these eggs can survive with no water for up to 8 months. And in warmer climates, this means that mosquitoes can actually overwinter as eggs. And once the eggs are in suitable still water, they'll hatch pretty quickly, as soon as a few days after being laid. And then the eggs, hatch into larvae, which is kind of represented at the bottom of this circle on the slide. And these larvae, again, are aquatic, so they live in the water, and they feed on microorganisms, and then develop into pupa in about 5 days. And the pupa are the last stage before becoming flying adults, and pupation takes only about 2 to 3 days. And then after that, the adult mosquito flies off and is away from the kind of more aquatic environment. So this means that the entire life cycle of a mosquito can take place in as few as 8 to 10 days. And with the number of eggs that a female can lay, this means that they can reproduce and population can really explode quite quickly. Okay, so now let's talk about mosquito control. We'll touch a little bit on the issues with pesticide-intensive management at home, and then talk about some more effective and ecologically safe methods at home to prevent mosquito populations from building in your yards and broader communities. But first, I want to do a quick detour to talk about pesticides and why we're concerned with them, which is kind of like the crux of this talk in many respects, since many people do use insecticides to kill adult mosquitoes, also called adulticides. So quickly taking that step back, when we're talking about pesticides, we're generally talking about insecticides, which kill insects, as well as herbicides, which kill plants, and fungicides, which kill fungi. There are many more categories of pesticides, but these are what we're mostly concerned with. And most of you are likely aware that many insecticides are highly toxic to pollinators and other insects. And some insecticides are more targeted than others in the groups of insects that they impact, but many tend to be very broad. They kill target pests, but also everything else in your yard. And this is one of those things that I think is important to keep in mind when we're talking about treating a pest like mosquitoes. These products will kill the target pest, but also all of the other beneficial organisms in your yard that you're trying, or insects in your yard that you're trying to conserve. This can actually lead to worse pest problems down the road because those natural enemies aren't there to try to keep some of the pest insects in check. And modern insecticides are very potent, and the newer ones, you may have heard of neonicotinoids or neonics that have been made to replace older chemicals, aren't more friendly to bees and other insects and are actually more concerning. And I want to note really quickly that one of the other downsides of pesticides is that they only treat the symptom, the pest outbreak itself, not the cause of the outbreak. And it's kind of like taking Advil for a headache, when you really need to get new glasses or stop staring at computer screens for as long. So when we think about pesticides, we often think about agricultural areas, but they're commonly used in urban and suburban areas as well. And in fact, more pesticides are often used per acre in urban areas than in many agricultural areas. In our communities, pesticides are often used for cosmetic reasons to maintain manicured, kind of curated landscapes. But I think something that's exciting about urban and suburban landscapes is that yards can actually function as really high quality pollinator and invertebrate habitat. But these yards and green spaces need to be managed correctly. And this, of course, includes planting appropriate flowers for food and creating nesting locations for insects. But it also involves protecting these areas from pesticides. We don't want to be putting all of this effort into creating habitat for pollinators and other insects, and then risk having them be exposed to toxic pesticides. And something else to keep in mind is that the way we manage our yards has an impact on more than just the site level. Urban landscapes have a lot of paved and impervious surfaces, so hardscapes, and pesticide applications can wash off from patios, sidewalks, driveways, and even grass and end up in our waterways. So this might be a little bit in the weeds, but I do want to touch on pesticide oversight and why just following the label isn't enough to protect pollinators and other insects. And in fact, we want to do much more than just follow the label on pesticides. Current federal regulation states that pesticides should have no unreasonable adverse effects, but that's really open to interpretation. Federal pesticide regulation both accepts and expects there to be risks to wildlife. They just believe that the benefits provided by pesticides outweigh the harm that they cause. So when we're trying to recover pollinator species or create havens for insects in our homes and yards, that standard isn't enough, which is why we encourage you to go beyond just following what's on the label to find ways to truly protect these species. So there's a long list of ways that the EPA, which is the federal agency overseeing pesticides, their assessments underestimate the risk to pollinators, which then leads to harmful pesticide uses. And I'll just list a few concerns really quickly. So they focus on one chemical at a time. Pesticides are rarely found alone in the environment, whether sampling is of water, soil, or pollinator habitat of plants. Xerces has done a few studies looking at pesticide residues on plants in various situations. And for example, we did a recent study on retail milkweed, looking at milkweed plants in nurseries that we performed with partners. And we found up to 28 pesticides per plant on milkweed plants on the shelf at nurseries. So this just goes to show that you're really never finding these chemicals in isolation. The assessments also don't consider specific risks to native bees and butterflies, like contaminated soil for ground nesting bees isn't considered, even though independent research has shown harm, or what this exposure does to the immature stages of insects instead of adults. And another problem with standard toxicity testing is that the EPA really heavily weighs one outcome in their decision-making, which is death of the insect. But bees that are exposed to less than a dose that kills them can have other negative responses. And we call these sublethal effects. So a sublethal effect is anything short of death, such as decreased growth, a behavioral change, a change in physiology, a change in learning ability, things like that. And many of these impacts might reduce a bee's ability to reproduce or to gather pollen and nectar for its offspring. And these small effects can really add up at the population level. So with COVID tests being so common these days, lots of people talk about false negatives due to COVID testing. And similarly, you can think of the EPA's risk assessment process as allowing for false negatives in that we miss the actual risk. Okay, so bringing these thoughts on pesticides back to our mosquito talk today, an overarching goal is to kind of touch on home mosquito sprays and why they tend not to be as effective as other methods of mosquito management, and why they're detrimental to the populations of beneficial insects in your yards. So this includes pollinators like bees, butterflies, natural enemies like lady beetles, ground beetles, parasitoid wasps, pretty much all invertebrates. There are better, safer solutions that don't rely on toxic insecticide sprays. So home mosquito sprays are often performed by specialized companies, and these companies most commonly spray pyrethroids. As a group, these are highly toxic insecticides that kill more than just mosquitoes. They're broad spectrum, meaning they kill all sorts of other invertebrates as well. Pyrethroids are related to pyrethrins, naturally occurring toxins that are found in chrysanthemum flowers. But pyrethroids are synthetic versions similar in structure that are often more toxic and more persistent than pyrethrins, which can be quite toxic as well. And these include, but aren't limited to, bifenthrin, deltamethrin, permethrin. These are some active ingredients you might hear. There's many others that are used, but these are some that are used by various mosquito spray companies. And risks to insects can vary. The biggest impact is likely to the insects that are out flying or out crawling on the plants when the sprays happen and they get directly contacted by that application. But some species might crawl a lot on treated plants, which increases their exposure risk, especially if there's more persistent chemicals used. And this persistence can vary from a few days to weeks. And when more persistent insecticides are used, this means they can linger on the plant surfaces and again create that extra risk. in particular to insects like butterflies and moths, since the caterpillars, the larval stage of these pollinators, feed on leaf tissue. If they're contaminated with pyrethroids, that's obviously a big risk. In urban and suburban areas where these home mosquito treatments are mostly occurring, as I mentioned earlier, these landscapes have a huge proportion of impervious surfaces. And what I mean by this, are hardscapes, places where water runs right off, like in this image here. So this includes things like driveways, sidewalks, patios, and roads. And in urban areas, often our lawns are so compacted that they essentially function as impervious surfaces. And all of these hard surfaces make it really easy for pesticide applications to wash off-site and get into our waterways. US Geological Survey testing has found high amounts of pesticides in streams throughout urban areas. And pyrethroids, going back to the chemicals that we were talking about in the last slide, are particularly toxic to aquatic insects and to invertebrates. Beyond impacting the populations of these species, this can also disrupt the food chain as birds, fish, and amphibians rely on these insects for food. And pyrethroids are also directly toxic to fish. So this is just kind of a quick reminder that the things that we do in our homes and yards often can have broader impacts elsewhere in the landscape. So thinking about home mosquito spraying, beyond being toxic to insects in general, when we're looking at community management and disease control, home mosquito sprays are ultimately not very effective. They only target the adult mosquitoes, which isn't going to put a very big dent in the overall population. Though you might see mosquito numbers in your yard reduced for a short amount of time, mosquitoes are very mobile insects, and even if you kill the adults, new ones will quickly fly over the fence. And this is a reason that community-wide management methods are so important. And additionally, new adults can also keep emerging from stagnant water as well, as we were talking about. So spraying adult mosquitoes is a short-term solution that's site-specific, that doesn't address the broader problem kind of throughout the overall landscape. To compound the issues that are caused by these home mosquito sprays, pest control companies often use all sorts of tactics to try and get people to sign up and participate. They'll send salespeople door to door to try and get people to sign up for preventative or prophylactic sprays, meaning they'll apply pesticides on a regular schedule and not do any type of monitoring of pest insect populations to try to justify those applications. I've even heard of discounts being given if multiple people on one block show up. So there's a lot of sales tactics that can be used. Some of the language that these companies use can be misleading as well. They can tout their applications as being safe without disclosing what they're actually spraying, nor mention that all the other insects that come into contact with these insecticides might die or be harmed. So a well-intentioned resident or homeowner just trying to not get bitten by mosquitoes might think that these applications only kill mosquitoes and that hiring these companies isn't causing any type of ecological harm, when in fact they are toxic to the broader insect communities in their yard. And additionally, there's often an element of greenwashing. When asked, companies will often say that their chemicals are natural or just derived from flowers, when in fact they are synthetic and toxic. And even if they are spraying pyrethrum, just because something is natural doesn't always mean it's safe. And these companies also have advertising budgets, and ads will end up at the top of Google search results. And they have high search engine optimization often. So when people are searching for home mosquito management, a lot of these sites will end up at the top of searches, which kind of makes it hard to compete with when trying to get ecologically minded management information out into the internet. And there's even outfits that sell automated mosquito misting systems. So these are permanent installations, often along home fences, that will automatically spray insecticides on a schedule to kill mosquitoes in your yard. I found one that advertises that their mister sprays only twice a day for 30 to 60 seconds. And they also tend to use pyrethroids in these systems. So you can imagine how much of an impact these regular applications, twice a day, might have on the other pollinator and beneficial insect populations in those yards. Okay, so now that we've talked about the downsides of chemical mosquito control, what can you do to help manage mosquitoes at home? So the number one thing you can do is simply eliminate standing water, also called source reduction. And this removes the breeding habitat for mosquitoes, and it's the most effective thing you can do. And it's really imperative to start doing this early in the season because this will help keep mosquito populations from building. As we talked about earlier, they can lay hundreds of eggs, and all they need is a tiny amount of water, again, like a bottle cap size. So really be diligent, especially early in the season, to try and start emptying out places where stagnant water is collecting. Um, as we mentioned earlier, again, the stagnant water that mosquitoes require, the process of their life cycle only takes 8 to 10 days. So water that stands around for just over a week can lead to a population explosion. So dump water from buckets, trash cans, look for things like hidden flower pots or old tires that might have filled with rain. Another place where water can really collect that people don't necessarily see is gutters. If the gutters are clogged, this can really be a kind of a surprise, unseen source of stagnant water. And then another really good suggestion is every few days to try and dump and refill water sources like pet bowls and bird baths to prevent any mosquito larvae from completing their life cycle. You in that image there, I remember, one house I lived in had a mosquito or a bird bath that looked very similar. And, it's really important to kind of get that stagnant water out so the mosquitoes can't live there. And you can even look for places like driveway potholes to fill in, or even if you have depressions in the lawn that you can kind of fill in and raise, because these can harbor puddles that mosquitoes can utilize as breeding habitat. And again, it's really important to start doing this early to help prevent mosquito populations from exploding as the spring and summer progress. So if you have a permanent body of water, like a backyard pond, there are things you can and should do to control mosquitoes. So as we've been talking about, mosquitoes can only reproduce in still water. So this simple inclusion of a small water feature, like in that photo there, like a little waterfall, or even just a small pump to keep the water moving, just having that little bit of movement is all that's needed to make the pond inhospitable to mosquitoes. If you use an open water pump, add protective screening, since pumps can pull in dragonfly and damselfly nymphs and kill them. And beyond just wanting to conserve insects like these for their own sake, you want to keep dragonflies and damselflies in your yard and pond to help control mosquitoes, as we'll talk about next. So another thing you can do is encourage natural enemies. So natural enemies are other organisms that eat the pest out in nature. So insects, a variety of insects will eat mosquitoes, as well as birds and bats. Those are all considered natural enemies. And research has shown that diverse native plantings harbor larger, more diverse populations of insect natural enemies. And native plants have also been found to increase native insect populations, which can in turn support more birds, which of course eat mosquitoes. So plant native plants, plant a variety of different types, sizes, textures. All of this can help support a diversity of different types of natural enemies. I do want to note that predation by birds and bats likely won't have noticeable effects on the populations of mosquitoes in your yard, but it's still a good thing to do just to create a functioning ecosystem in your yard, and it can't hurt. Aquatic habitat, though, is a slightly different story, which we'll talk about next. So if you do have a backyard pond or wetland area, there are things that you can do to manage it to better support natural enemies that will feed on mosquitoes. So larval predators of mosquitoes like dragonflies and damselflies all have the same basic needs. They need clean water, food, and habitat that serves as a refuge to mate and reproduce. So a diversity of aquatic vegetation is important because this vegetation takes up nutrients, oxygenates and cools the water, and it creates shelter for juvenile stages of these insects. For adults, the vegetation provides perches when they're looking for mates and a place for them to lay eggs. And then vegetation outside of the pond, kind of in more upland areas, provides a place for insects like dragonflies to roost, hunt, mate, and then take refuge. This is getting a little bit beyond the scope of our talk today, but we have resources for managing backyard ponds for dragonflies and damselflies available in our online Xerces library that are really detailed. It includes talking about pond construction, location, plant choice, and more. So if you do have a pond and you're interested in learning how to manage it for habitat purposes, I encourage you to look at that publication. So beyond getting rid of standing water, there are other preventative measures that you can take to avoid being bitten. So you can protect yourself from bites by wearing long sleeves when mosquitoes are active. And then also make sure that your window screens are intact so that mosquitoes can't get into your house. If you're sitting outside on your porch or your patio, consider putting out a fan when you're sitting there, as mosquitoes can't fly even when there's light winds, so that can prevent you from being bitten. So these things might sound simple or obvious, but they really do work. Some of you might be familiar with larvicides. So these are things that will kill the larva as opposed to adulticides that kill the adults. So one that's common are BT dunks, which you can buy and use at home. The active ingredient is Bacillus thuringiensis, a species of bacteria that lives in the soil and is often used as an insecticide. And there's a strain used in what are called mosquito dunks. So these pucks that, I have an image of it on this slide, that are placed in water that dissolve. And they're marketed as only killing mosquitoes. And while they are fairly targeted, these dunks actually kill all flies, so things in the Diptera family, not just mosquitoes. And these insects play other important roles in ecosystems, and don't necessarily want to be killing them. And we also don't know the non-lethal or those sublethal effects that these dunks might have on other insects, or things like the soil when the water is dumped. So at home, we still do recommend first considering other options, first removing that stagnant water or refilling bird baths, as we talked about a few slides ago, since it is easy and it has no downside. And sometimes municipalities need to use larvicides to control disease vectoring, mosquito outbreaks, and BT is often used, but sometimes agencies also use more broadly toxic insecticides. And sometimes larval biocontrols are often used by vector control districts, sometimes insect or fish predators. And these can have an effect, but it's kind of a complicated issue because there needs to be decisions made about whether certain species are suitable for introduction into different areas. So kind of similar to what we were just talking about there on the larvicide slide, I want to note that home mosquito sprays are distinct from sprays done by local vector control, whether that's the city or the county. So many times vector control agencies will spray adulticides to kill adult mosquitoes, which is often done in response to disease concern, but may be also done preemptively, unfortunately. For example, in 2016, 16 people were diagnosed with Zika in North Carolina, and officials in Dorchester County made aerial applications of insecticide, even though all of the Zika cases were contracted outside of the United States. And not all beekeepers were able to protect their hives, and millions of honeybees were killed. And of course, we have no idea how many native pollinators were killed, but one can imagine it was a huge number, especially since nobody's out there trying to protect them. So the better, smarter strategy is trying to figure out which mosquito species are present and whether they are actually carrying disease. Vector control districts can and should monitor mosquito populations carefully so that any intervention programs can be carried out early and effectively against actual hotspots of disease-carrying mosquitoes and avoid the use of adulticides. Using adulticides as part of a vector control strategy is a choice that each community needs to make. And mosquito-borne disease can and has been controlled without any adulticides at all. But not all communities make that choice. And we'll talk about some examples in a moment. So earlier in this talk, I mentioned that good mosquito control happens at the community level. So it's really important to do your part and try to eliminate standing water in your yard, which will hopefully give you some population reduction at home. But as we learned earlier, mosquitoes are mobile, and no matter what you do, if your neighbor has great mosquito habitat, you'll still see adult mosquitoes flying over into your yard. So in this light, I hope you can see why spraying insecticides at home isn't necessarily community-minded, while source reduction or eliminating standing water is. Another example of how the choices and the management practices you take at home can influence the broader landscape. So for things you can do at the neighborhood level or the level of your block, it might not sound simple, but try talking to your neighbors about mosquito management and source reduction. Of course, I'd encourage you to start with neighbors that you already have a good relationship with. And for maybe neighbors that you haven't communicated with much yet, breaking the ice with other topics is likely a better strategy before jumping straight into mosquito management and pesticide use. But it really can make a difference. Inspiration for me comes from my boss, Ama's neighborhood, that has a neighborhood pledge to not use pesticides that was started years ago by a 6-year-old child who went door to door. And Ama says that to this day, when someone new moves into the neighborhood, somebody asks them to take the pledge. So a whole neighborhood of people practicing common sense mosquito management will have a much larger impact than just one yard. So moving up to the community level, there are grassroots things that you can do. And I think a really great example of a broader community-wide campaign is in Decatur, Georgia. They're part of Xerces Bee City USA program. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a program in which affiliate communities make several commitments to protect pollinators. And one of these commitments involves pesticide reduction. And Decatur has really jumped in and done a great job with that. In particular, they've been focusing on pesticide reduction when it comes to mosquito sprays. Being in the South, it's a humid environment, there's lots of mosquitoes. But what they've started doing is expanding the information section they have about residential mosquito spraying on their Bee City website, developing literature to hand out, and creating large mosquito spraying kills bees branded signs like this one, or these two in the photo, that people can put in yards. As part of their public education campaign, they make use of social media, table at events like farmers markets or at nurseries, do presentations to neighborhood associations and community groups, and then also work with the city's environmental sustainability board to try to enact formal policies that emphasize alternatives to chemical controls. And then speaking of pledges, they also have not spraying for mosquitoes as a central tenet of their ongoing Decatur Pollinator Pledge program to try to keep people's properties pollinator friendly. So I think this is a really inspiring example of a way that community members have come together to do outreach, education, and then also policy targeted at reducing pesticide use in their community. So also, at the community level are these, vector control districts or municipalities that are in charge of managing mosquito populations on more public lands and across the broader landscape, and coordinating community-wide responses. And many of them do fantastic work, and I'll give a few examples on the next slides. But in other cases, the management plans may be lacking. As a quick general summary, a good program involves investing in public education and communication to make sure that everyone knows what they can do to stay safe, healthy, and reduce mosquito populations at home through some of the common sense methods that we've talked about today. But a good program should also involve active monitoring of mosquitoes and thresholds for tolerance, in particular for disease incidence and population of the mosquito species that are the ones responsible for vectoring diseases. High populations of other mosquito species might be a significant nuisance, warranting non-chemical reduction efforts, but they're not what should trigger chemical treatments. When diseases are found at concerning levels and the municipality decides to treat, we of course encourage ecologically responsible interventions, such as only treating waterways where disease-carrying mosquitoes are found and trying to use least toxic options. So with this in mind, if you want to get involved and kind of understand what's happening in your community and your district, the first step is to learn what is happening in your area. and find out if your county or municipality has a mosquito management plan. And if so, does it include monitoring? Is there an outreach program to promote efforts at home to try to reduce mosquito concerns? Do they spray for mosquitoes? And if so, do they have thresholds, such as only when disease incidence reaches a certain threshold? I think an effective plan for managing mosquitoes takes kind of an all hands on deck approach. And this involves community members as well as local agencies working together. So for some examples, the city of Boulder is a great success story. In 2003, there was an epidemic of West Nile virus, and the city came up with a holistic, ecologically friendly management program. Many municipalities routinely sprayed insecticides to control adult mosquitoes, while Boulder was able to not spray adulticides at all. So Boulder monitored and identified locations that carried the mosquitoes that were the main vector for West Nile in Boulder, and they didn't treat locations where they weren't present. So it was really targeted. And they used larvicides to only treat those locations and kept monitoring for the presence of West Nile. And when mosquitoes test positive, the city increases efforts to eliminate standing water and also expanding public outreach to involve the whole community in preventative measures. So this is an example of how a control district can kind of use a holistic approach to control disease vectoring mosquitoes while minimizing toxic insecticide use. Nearby to Boulder, the city of Fort Collins has their own success story in mosquito vector disease management that highlights the importance of other strategies, in particular prevention at home, calling back to that slide on preventative approaches that you can take. In that same 2003 West Nile virus outbreak, they surveyed residents both in Fort Collins as well as in Loveland, which is a city just south of Fort Collins, and marked both on this map here. And in the study, they found that Fort Collins residents were much more likely to implement personal protective measures like wearing long sleeves, applying repellent, and avoiding outdoor activities when mosquitoes are most active. And despite the fact that Fort Collins actually had a greater abundance of mosquitoes and West Nile positive mosquitoes compared to Loveland, Fort Collins had half as many incidences of severe disease, likely because the community was using these preventative measures. So again, this is just an example of how mosquito management and personal kind of preventative measures can all work together to reduce disease incidence. So as I wrap up here, I want to encourage you all to think of your yard as habitat. Your yard is being used by a broad community of insects, birds, other animals, in addition to insects that can be nuisances like mosquitoes. And I do want to emphasize again that the choices that we make in our yards, in green spaces, and residential landscapes really do have wide-reaching impacts on biodiversity. And I encourage you to think about that broad community of other life when you're making management decisions. And I want to end by re-emphasizing that you can make a difference at home. Habitat loss and fragmentation is the leading cause of species extinctions. But I think the really exciting news is that insects are able to use small patches like yards, and the improvements to habitats at home really can have dramatic results. Beyond planting habitat plants and making sure that you have nesting resources, protecting these spaces from pesticides is one of the most important things you can do to provide habitat for invertebrates. So by not spraying for mosquitoes at home and using these ecologically minded management and prevention practices, you really can create a haven for pollinators and beneficial insects. And I want to note real quick as I wrap up, we have a number of mosquito-related resources in our Xerces library, including one on supporting ecologically sound mosquito management, a longer one on helping your community create an effective mosquito management plan, one on ecologically sound mosquito management in wetlands, and then that one I mentioned earlier about creating backyard pond habitat for dragonflies and damselflies. So with that, thank you all so much for attending this webinar, and we have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Aaron. We do have lots of good questions coming in, so I'm just going to dive right in. I know Amay is answering some on here as well, so I'll just throw those out and you guys can decide who wants to answer them. So this question is probably something a lot of people wonder, and you touched on it a little bit. I didn't know if you had any further comments, but Do any of the pesticide companies that claim their spray does not hurt pollinators, does that actually exist, or are they all lying?
May, I'm not sure what your perspective on that is. I don't want to make blanket statements, but
No, I could start. I was looking for my unmute, but
yeah.
and then add whatever I've forgotten. It's hard to say what these companies are, what service they're going to offer. If they're targeting adult mosquitoes, it is highly unlikely that you're not going to see some other impacts, especially to terrestrial insects and to our pollinators. Even if it's an organic product, some of these organic, they aren't without harm, as Aaron kind of did cover. If the company is taking a step back and doing the sort of actions that we talk about that everyone can take, where you're, source reduction and, dumping those containers that mosquitoes are breeding in, and taking a prevention type technique, or maybe some control of larvae, you might see that you're not going to be having pollinator impact. So it really depends on what service they're offering. But if someone comes to your house and said they've got a non-toxic solution, I would doubt it. I mean, in fact, some of these questions are like, what is your solution? And mosquitoes are going to be a challenge, and they're going to be a nuisance. Like, we can't solve all of the problems, but yeah, hope that answers. I don't know, anything you'd add, Aaron?
No, I think that was a great answer, May. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, May. To follow up with that question, Denise, I think it's the same Denise that's actually an ambassador as well. Welcome. She and her neighborhood, they have a new company offering eco-friendly mosquito control, which does include pest management with integrated pest management. And they use a spray that contains several different types of oils, including peppermint oil, clove oil, and geraniol. And she hasn't found any good information of the effects of geraniol. And do you have any information on whether that's harmful to insects or simply deters them?
So I actually was going to write that down. Geraniol is not something I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I'm not either.
So Denise, and thank you for being an ambassador. Everyone, our ambassadors are this brilliant group of people at Xerces that help spread the word, and they have to go through this whole process with Rachel. So thank you, Denise, for being an ambassador. Anyone else is interested, connect with Rachel. Denise, can you email us at, what is it, pesticide or pesticides at xerces.org?
It's pesticides with an S, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we can respond, because that's something that we need to dig into as well. Yeah, it's tricky. I feel like, and going back to what Aaron spoke to at the very beginning, sprays in a yard for a lot of mosquitoes is not going to be a long-term solution anyway. I mean, granted, things like Asian tiger mosquito, they don't fly that far. They're only going to fly about a half mile, but some mosquito species can fly up to 20 miles. So getting your yard treated, even if it's something that's a lower toxicity option, isn't really the way to be looking at mosquito management. In fact, like that Aaron mentioned, my neighborhood and our pesticide-free pledge. Last year, we helped a woman who wasn't able to clean her own gutters, but we were having mosquito issues, and we kind of went around and we had our own little standing water attack team going through the neighborhood to help. So
I love it.
So we have a few questions about mosquito dunks. Someone is asking about removing water completely off of pool covers. They said they've tried everything and it's really difficult. And someone else is asking about rain barrels. So do you have any suggestions on that?
So rain barrels, there was a wonderful study from, and I cannot remember where, it was not in the United States, but it was looking at actually at dragonflies and having, if you can promote natural enemies in your yard and try to have your rain barrel actually have more than just mosquito larvae in it, they can eat quite a few of the mosquitoes. Also in your rain barrel, making sure you better cover it so that you're not going to have larvae, being able to be produced. So if you can put screens in there so that mosquitoes can't get into that, that's a great idea. Someone else later on, one of the questions was actually about if we use the mosquito traps, which are, water in a bucket. was skeptical of it, but I've been reading more and more, and actually you can draw mosquitoes to these traps, and maybe that's another way to help minimize the larva production in something like your rain barrel. But I'm about to have to face that because I actually just put in 2 rain barrels. So I'll let you know after this mosquito season what all I figured out.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, May. And I think the first thing that popped in my head was, yeah, also just if you can try to have some sort of covering that tries to kind of exclude some of those mosquitoes, that would be a great way to do it. But I think, yeah, your comment about the traps and, yeah, I think that's a good thing to try to chase down.
So Sergio left us a comment. Thank you. Geraniol is actually citronella oil. It's just another name for it. So I don't know if, I think we had that question on one of our first webinars. Someone asked if citronella candles were bad for pollinators. We weren't actually able to answer that question. We weren't sure.
A lot of the, like we were talking about the clove oil, garlic oil, citronella, they can deter pollinators from coming to areas. So these really potent smells sometimes kind of act as a deterrent for pollinators to come to an area. We actually have a really great resource you could also look at that will have a little bit greater detail on organic pesticides and their impact to pollinators. And you can find that on our website as well. If you just go to Xerces website and search organic, the organic pesticides fact sheet will come up.
Thank you, May. So we have a few people asking about HOAs and if you have any suggestions on how to convince them to not spray for mosquitoes, and more specifically, how do people protect their yards from drift? Is there anything they can do?
That's a really tough question, and HOAs are something that we're really interested in kind of grappling with and figuring out good strategies for. I think in this case, I would recommend bringing to whether it's your HOA board, and if you have monthly meetings where you can discuss topics. I think some of the information that we were talking about today, the fact that source reduction is really the most important thing that you can do to try to manage mosquito populations and try to share that information. I think that if you can also potentially start sharing information about the negative impacts of mosquito spraying, that could be compelling as well. I know sometimes in these situations the argument about cost can come into play. You might be able to argue that with mosquito source reduction and management, trying to keep the populations from building at all, you might just completely eliminate the need for these sprays. I think those would be strategies that I would suggest trying to start with. I don't know, Emma, if you have things to add there.
The only thing to add is that I always feel like with almost all pesticide issues, but definitely when we're talking about public health concerns and the fears that people have around different, mosquitoes being vectors for disease, it's really important to come into these conversations with in a way that's not controversial and not polarizing. Yes, I might feel really uncomfortable knowing that they're spraying insecticides at my HOA because of the concern for mosquitoes, but coming with that to the meeting won't necessarily convince folks. And I remember talking to a county commissioner years ago, and he said to me, "You're telling me not to put an airplane in the air." And the first, when someone comes to me and their grandmother has died from West Nile virus, I'm laying it at your feet. And I was like 25, newly minted, excited to make a difference in the world. So being really thoughtful about, there is fear out there, and some of it there are diseases that can be transmitted through mosquitoes. So being aware of that and being thoughtful about how effective the other method, prevention and source reduction, how effective they can be. And also really listening and hearing, and sometimes talking through some of the risk. A lot of the fear out there is greater than the actual risks that we have with some of the different vector-borne diseases, like Eastern equine encephalitis, triple E. You actually, it has to go through a bird first, and then an Aedes aegypti has to bite that bird in order to get to a human. I mean, so when we hear that disease is in the area, we have to step back and understand what the risk is of human, of carriers and actually human getting the disease too. I don't know if that helps, but
No.
we would love, if you want to talk to your HOA about this, we would love to kind of pull together ideas with you and help out. I think that would be a wonderful effort, and we would be happy to help with. So reach out to us.
Thank you, Ame. So we are at the hour. We're going to go a few minutes over for questions. We just want to be respectful of people's time, and this will be on YouTube, including the question section. So if you need to leave, you can catch up with those later. So this other question is from Lindsay, and at the edge of their property, they have brush and woodland with a layer of leaf litter. What can they do to control mosquito breeding in that type of environment?
That's a great question. I know that adult mosquitoes really take advantage of some of kind of like that low-lying vegetation that's kind of moist, especially during the day, to kind of hang out in. I think it might depend on the context. You know, if you open up into a broad woodland, it might be harder if you are kind of next to some sort of lot that has things like low-lying ground cover. If you're able to kind of thin some of that out so that it kind of removes those more kind of humid, shaded locations that adult mosquitoes kind of use as refuge, I think that would be a great thing. I think that if you can identify any places in there where there are kind of stagnant ponds, places where mosquitoes are actively breeding, that would also be something that I would encourage you, I think, to look at as well. And it gets difficult when you're talking about natural areas that are abutting your property, because obviously there's no way you can go out and manage that whole natural area. But I think, yeah, the suggestion of trying to eliminate some of that kind of dense, close to the ground vegetation, like right on the edge of your property, is something that might help a bit.
Yeah, that was when I saw that question. Erin, you're better than me. I was just thinking, oh man, that's just going to be really hard to answer. So, the reality is we can't always control. There are certain natural areas that are mosquito areas that we can't always control and contain. It's also interesting, many of the things that we talk about for benefiting the beneficial invertebrates can counter when we're trying to talk about mosquito management, things, like the different species that are going to live in that leaf litter that are so valuable to our system. So it's a tricky balance we have to when we're trying to deal with both of those issues together.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make. Like the leaf litter itself is actually probably beneficial, because you might be providing habitat for natural enemies that might potentially be
And someone
complex.
retyped again, remembering just how mosquitoes are terrible flyers. Some of them can fly a long way, but a light breeze or a fan goes such a long way for towards minimizing any mosquitoes coming to bother you, because they really are poor flyers, not strong at all.
That's
and I saw
the
question though. Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Erin.
Oh, I just saw that question that Laura just put in, the leaf litter thing. I'm not actually sure about leaf litter in particular. They don't breed in these locations. I just know that adult mosquitoes will kind of hang out in kind of more moist, humid, sheltered, shady areas, kind of close to the ground. So some of that kind of more dense, I think about something like English ivy. I think, but they're not breeding in these locations.
We had one policy question about whether these toxins are being stopped being applied at a nationwide level, not just at a state level. Are there any efforts being done to organize? I'm sure probably a lot easier said than done. But yeah, any organizations working on getting these toxins banned on a nationwide level?
There is not the national level that first comes to mind, but in Massachusetts, there's a really interesting effort underway to have at the state level have ecologically sound mosquito management like oversight, and then support for all the different communities. Because the reality is every community is oftentimes each county is dealing with mosquito management on their own, and they may have more or fewer resources to do that. And so if you have at the state level kind of overarching support to ensure that prevention and monitoring and scouting and early intervention can be something that can happen across the state, you're going to reduce the likelihood of knee-jerk reactions and fear-based reactions like Erin talked about with Zika, when it wasn't even established in the area. So I'm watching that with a lot of interest to see what happens in Massachusetts. And I know that question also pointed out to preemption. So you would, if it's at the state level, you could actually take action and wouldn't have to worry about the preemption piece. Yeah.
Thank you, Ame. Another specific question about mosquito traps. Nikki is wondering if mosquito traps with BT would be appropriate for early season targeted control.
You know, we always try to consider non-chemical or non-pesticidal options to start. You know, some people add BT to things where they really could very easily be dumping that water every time. There are places where you can't quickly dump water. You don't have easy ways to add something to make movement so that so mosquitoes can't breed. So the mosquito dunks have a place when you don't have other methods. We tend to urge people to stay away from them because they can be of concern to other dipterans. And if you only have nuisance mosquitoes in your area, you know, taking these other steps to prevent and manage and deal with them. I almost wanted to bring a video that I have of my daughter and I on a walk. My husband has this great picture of the two of us like zipping along with our hats flinging around. Like, how do we deal with these mosquitoes? So yes, there is a place, but be thoughtful about, don't just think that, oh, I have standing water, I need a dunk. A lot of times that isn't, you can get rid of it without, but sometimes they can work. Yeah.
And I'm not sure, that's a great answer. And I'm not as familiar with this with mosquito traps in particular, but I know sometimes with these kind of attractive traps, with insects in general, one concern is you can potentially be drawing more in, especially if you have a smaller yard. Maybe you're drawing mosquitoes in from neighboring yards that wouldn't necessarily even have come to your yard. So I think that is one consideration as well. I'm honestly not as, you know, personally familiar with like the efficacy of some of these traps, but
we also clearly have a lot of really valuable and supportive folks here on well. So like, thank you everyone for chiming in, because there's a lot of really valuable information. Can everyone see these Q&As, or should we read these, Rachel, when we've got answers coming at us?
For the chat, I'm not sure if everyone can see it. If you have a couple that you want to highlight, and feel free to read those comments, because we are getting some great ideas and feedback from people.
I'm slow to find things. I'll let you keep going and then I'll read them.
A lot of these questions are, I think, just very similar, asking about whether mosquito spray is okay. I'm assuming they mean on the individual, like spraying yourself with a repellent, and just different oils, if that would work. Some folks are asking if there are specific plants that would help deter, but I think having a greater biodiversity of plants that are blooming at different times brings in different invertebrates and birds, and overall we talked about how that will help reduce mosquitoes. Encouraging bats, that's a good one.
And then here's a couple. Rain barrels have screens on top that are very fine mesh, and actually Doug Talamy has directions to make a pail trap using straw, water, and dunks. So I haven't seen that yet.
No.
And then there was another one that I saw pop up. And then mosquito traps made from buckets treated with BTI need to be monitored and retreated according to the label on the BT formulations you're using. Some of the worst tiger mosquito infestations I've ever seen were caused by neglected traps.
Oh.
Great point. Yeah, don't create a trap and then ignore it. Because as Erin was saying, different mosquitoes and temperatures, all things impact how that life cycle and the length of it. But a lot of mosquitoes, you can go within a week and you can have a new population cropping up again.
So I think we'll just have time for one more question here. I saw pop up because someone else had asked about duckweed on the surface of ponds. And that for them seems to work in preventing eggs being later hatching of mosquitoes. Have you found that to be true with duckweed?
You know, I don't know. This is the first time that's kind of come up. But you know, it stands to reason that if you have, you know, potentially more vegetation that's eliminating spots that mosquitoes could lay eggs. I think that the key though is that, you know, as I was mentioning in my talk, mosquitoes need very little water in order to reproduce. You know, again, you know, that bottle cap image. So there's always going to be open, you know, surfaces on ponds and things like that, even if they have vegetation, where mosquitoes are going to be able to use that as a breeding site. So I don't think having duckweed on the surface would be a replacement for, again, as I was mentioning, having a little pump to circulate the water, things like that, and also encouraging the vegetation and you know, diverse assemblage of plants that will support natural enemies. But I'm glad that it sounds like that is working for you in your yard.
Thank you so much, Erin. May, I don't know if you, oh, go ahead, Erin. May.
Oh, just I saw one more note to that duckweed in natural ponds. Oh, it popped away. So I think what it said was that duckweed actually can be harborage for Culex mosquitoes. So I'm going to quick look at that again.
Good to know. Okay.
Yeah, a refuge for Culex. And a bridge, and potentially a bridge vector for triple E. So not always a good option. I was wondering, yeah, but I think, Erin, if you can have healthy systems that support, you know, beneficials, that does. There are a lot of, like, there's little crustaceans called copepods that are voracious mosquito larvae eaters. You know, there's a lot. So if you have a healthy environment, you can minimize the number of mosquitoes that you're going to have.